G'day, welcome back to RCM Model Reviews, and today I want to talk about the new Fatshark Dominator HD, what is it, WalkSnail Avatar HD digital system, the one that everyone's talking about and it's been sort of capturing people's attention. It's an alternative to the DJI system, it's an alternative to the HD0 system, and I don't have one. I was not one of the 3 favoured influencers who got sent out pre-production systems to make videos of. So I'm going to review a product I don't even have. How the hell can I do that? Well, obviously this won't be a teardown or anything like that, but there are some teardowns on YouTube already. I'm going to put a fairly useful list, I hope, of other people's videos in the description of this video. And I'm going to look at the videos that the 3 influencers who got the system have done. I'm going to try and draw some conclusions from what I see on those videos. I put my technical knowledge to the task of perhaps interpreting a little more than the influencers themselves could see in these videos. The influencers, of course, were Joshua Bardwell and Mr. Steele and oh my god, Tommy. They all got pre-release systems and they've all done videos. I waited to produce this video until I'd seen all their videos so that I could get a better, more rounded view of the system and perhaps give you some insights that they may not have seen, and that will help you if you're thinking, should I buy this thing? But let's talk a little bit about what the system is. It is a digital FPV system. It is built on the same design. It's not the same as DJI. A lot of people, including myself, speculated this could be DJI, but it's not. It is a system built using the same building blocks as DJI. Now, if you haven't seen my video, my whiteboard video already explaining how the DJI system works and HD0, then somewhere up here in one of these corners, I never remember which, there will be a little thing. You can click on that now, go and watch that video, especially the part about how DJI's digital system works. Once you've watched that, come back. I will wait for you. You back? Good. Now, the thing is that WalkSnail have basically looked at how DJI works. They probably watched my video and thought, this looks easy. And they have built a system that is functionally the same. It doesn't mean it's using exactly the same parts or the same design or the same firmware. They've built a system that is functionally the same as DJI. And you have to admit, some parts have definitely been inspired by DJI. There's a lot of similarities there, which was what caused many people initially to speculate, could this be DJI? Well, it's looking now very much like it's not, but some of the similarities are there because obviously they thought, if we produce a product that has a minimal learning curve, people that are using DJI already know the basics, it's going to sell better. And they probably also looked at it and said, well, the chipsets we're using require us to do these things because that's the way the chipset works. We've got to work around that. And since it's a fairly similar chipset between DJI and the WalkSnail, then naturally a lot of the parameters will be very similar as well. So, price-wise, I think it's $600 and something for the Fatshark or Avatar goggles. I can't remember what the air units are worth, but it's a fairly sizable investment. It's going to cost a fair bit of coin to get into that. And for that reason, I don't expect to see a lot of people who are using DJI or using HD0 selling all the equipment and buying into this straight away. It's not going to happen because just because they release a system like this doesn't mean your DJI doesn't work. It doesn't mean your HD0 doesn't work. And it doesn't mean your analog doesn't work. So if you're already flying any of those other systems, carry on flying. This isn't going to affect you one bit. But if you're sitting on the fence, if you're thinking, maybe you're flying analog and you think, I really want to get into the digital FPV, should I buy this? Well, hopefully I'm going to give you enough information to make that decision in this meta-analysis of other reviews. Now, a very wise man once said, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And I think Fatshark, WalkSnail dropped the ball a little there. I mean, they had the Rotor Riot video, which it was enticing, it was a teaser, but then the first footage I saw of the new system was this published by JB in his review, and I got to admit, it looked terrible. It looked like he was flying in fog. There was a haziness to the image, and the ground detail disappeared, and the leaves on the trees disappeared as soon as there was any motion in the video. It looked really kind of poor, actually. In fact, it looked worse than analog once you started moving that drone through the air. That was a very bad first impression. That was a limitation caused by the way the system is configured, by the way the firmware is written that handles the compression. And it became very apparent when he was flying in areas with a lot of detail. Even a small amount of movement caused the Minecraft effect, as I call it, where instead of getting this image, you get pixelated blocks. You can actually see the patchwork quilt of blocks that make up the H.265 encoding matrix. The H.265, if you don't know, and H.264, what they do is they take a big picture and divide it up into smaller blocks and then compress those. They also do something rather clever. They take a picture like you would with your camera, JPEG or whatever, a picture of the world, and then as things change, they send further frames, but they don't send the whole frame. It's not a series of complete pictures. The following frames are just the difference between the first frame and what things look like now. And then they send another difference frame. So they have iframes, which are the image frames, and then they have all these other frames which are just derived as a result of the differences between what happened in the last frame and what happens in this frame. So there's a lot of detail that gets sent in delta form. It's just difference between various frames, and then after a while, because you get errors building up, they send another iframe which gives you another complete picture. So naturally, as you're moving, the image degrades because there's just not enough data to present the differences accurately, and that is a very difficult thing to tune because there are so many parameters in an H.265 encoder. There are so many parameters. There's areas of interest, there's the bit rate, there's so many things that you can adjust to make the picture look good. In fact, if you've done any video editing, you probably looked at where you get to the part where you're rendering the file. There's all these options. There's main 10, there's the maximum bit rate, there's single pass, multipass, there's so many different parameters, and they're just a tiny fraction of what you can set with an H.265 encoder. It is just a nightmare. And also remember, we're dealing with a hardware encoder which may not have as much in the way of configurability as a software encoder. This chip that they're using there almost certainly has a hard. You couldn't encode at this bit rate with a software encoder. I'm pretty sure they've got a dedicated piece of hardware on that system chip that does the video encoding, and that means there are limits to what they can configure because it's not like software. You can't change it all. You've got the building blocks. You're limited a little bit by the physicality of that encoder, and of course, the more effort you spend encoding, quite often the longer it takes, which means your latency goes up. So there's trade-offs everywhere. There's no free lunches. Every time you tweak one thing, something else changes. So very, very difficult task to tune the video encoder. And that showed in that first video from Joshua Bardwell and the one that Steele Davis did, that Mr. Steele did. You know, that the loss of detail and movement was absolutely atrocious. It was terrible. It was almost unflyable. If you're close to the ground, you can't see how far you are. It's just a blur. And that's one of the things that the first impressions a lot of people got was, this is atrocious. And to give you an idea of how important that tuning is, if you look at the DJI system, they have a thing called focus mode. This may have focus mode, but I haven't seen it in any of the videos that have been shown. Focus mode, they've tuned the encoder to such an extent that DJI realized the closer to the center you are, the more important that information is. So they've split the image into two parts, the edges and the center in focus mode. They give more bit rate to the center image than the sides, because it doesn't matter what's out to the sides as much as what's in the middle. So they have created a split bit rate, so you get pixelated sides while the center of the image remains relatively good. They're dedicating the bandwidth to where it needs to be, where you're going, where you're looking at. So that's just an example of how DJI has had years to do this stuff. They've had years to tune it, and that's what they've come up with, this focus mode, which is really, really good if you're flying in an environment where your signal strength is going to vary dramatically, so your bit rate will vary dramatically. I haven't seen that happen on the WalkSnail system, on the Fatshark system, but they may be implementing that later as an option. I can only wait and see in regards to that. That early image in the first of Joshua Bardwell's videos too also looked very smeary. It looked kind of low contrast, looked misty, which seems more like a camera issue than an encoding issue. But I noticed that he published another video with updated firmware. And this is something that I'm going to talk about quite a bit, updated firmware. And the results just night and day. The contrast is dramatically improved, the clarity is improved, and more importantly, the detail is still largely preserved once you start moving. So they've altered that algorithm. They've favored it towards allowing more detail with movement rather than when static. And it's just night and day. It's almost, but not quite as good as DJI. They still don't seem to have a focus mode, but maybe that wasn't turned on in any of these videos. I don't know. But the result is we can see immediately by comparing side by side the original footage from Joshua Bardwell with the footage from the updated firmware that tuning is critical. Tuning will make or break this system. Just that small change they've made a huge, fantastic difference, and it negates many of the complaints I had about the detail disappearing with movement, because the first version, as soon as you move, the leaves turned into a blur, the ground turned into a blur. The new version, it still does it to a degree, but nowhere near as much. So is it tuned? No, not yet. There's a long way to go, because one thing I noticed in JB's underground tests when he was testing in the car park is there is a lot of stutter, and also noticed on Steele Davis's video, a lot of stutter. And stutter means where basically the image freezes, may only be for a fraction of a second, but in some cases it froze for a little while. And that's what happens there is that the system has no valid data to display. So it just keeps the last frame. And that's very disconcerting. If you're flying proximity and you're moving at a speed and suddenly the world stops, you know the drone is still going. You don't know what's going to happen when the picture comes back. So that is quite worrying. I noticed DJI, it can stutter a little, but more often it tends to degrade the image. It favors getting a lower quality image to give you a faster response, keep the frames coming, than it does to keep the quality of the image there. So I think they have some tuning to do in that side of things, where they balance bandwidth against latency, against picture detail. And all these three things interact. So you change one and it affects the other. So it's not just a simple case of ticking a few boxes. You have to do a balancing act. You have to do a lot of experimentation. You have to try stuff out and come up with ways of getting the best compromise. It's always going to be a compromise. The DJI have done a stunning job in adjusting that compromise for the best results. As a FPV pilot, I find it fantastic what they've done. WalkSnail is a wee way away from that yet. They still have a bit more tuning to do, but hey, the benefit of the advantage is that the hardware seems pretty solid. This hardware seems to work. And if it's just firmware, if it's just software changes, well, you just download a change, whack it on your video transmitter and your goggles, away you go. It's like you got a new set of gear. So I don't see that as a big drawback, except for early adopters who might wish it worked better out of the box. Now, as for the goggles themselves, they do have OLED screens, and they do have, I think, 46-degree field of view, which is pretty good, like Sky Zones or HD02s or whatever they were. Your average OLED goggles seems pretty much in line with that. And one of the things I actually kind of like about the DJI FPV system is the goggles. Now, they're big, they're bulky, they make you look like an ant or some kind of bug monster, but they do have an extremely wide field of view. It's about 52 degrees from memory, and although the colors aren't as vivid or vibrant as an OLED, the screens themselves are quite large, which means you get virtually no distortion and no vignetting. You get to see the whole thing. It's very immersive. And I know when I wear my Sky Zones, which are 46 degrees or something with OLEDs, much brighter, more vivid picture, but you are aware that the field of view isn't as bright, and sometimes you can get a bit of vignetting if you don't have everything just set up perfectly. The DJI goggles are just throw them on your face and they work. And with the OLED goggles, because the optics are so much smaller, positioning is more important. It's a personal thing. I like them both. I love flying with my OLED goggles because of the colors and the vibrancy. I love flying with DJI because of the immersiveness. So it depends whether you're a wide field of view man or an extra wide field of view man, which you will like better. One thing that I don't like about the Fatshark goggles is they have no video input, no analog and no digital, no HDMI input, which is kind of a shame because if you're going to buy this, you might have to sell your DJI and your analog goggles to afford your WalkSnail goggles or your Fatshark goggles, and that would mean you wouldn't have access to analog anymore. It's a bit of an oversight to not have an analog or whatever input. It does have video output through the USB-C, but that's not a clean output. It'll include all the OSD stuff, which you may or may not want. But I know people like Tommy and I think JB also want a clean output. And clean means the OSD stuff's removed. It's just perfectly just what the camera sees is all you get coming out. That's really handy in production work and movies and stuff, where you might have a director of photography who wants to see what it's going to look like on screen rather than have it cluttered up with stuff he's not interested in. So again, that's just firmware. So this can be fixed at any stage in the future. Now, the price of these goggles, I think, was $600. Ooh, but you've got to get your own. I think the Fatshark doesn't come with antennas, so you can throw another $100 worth of antennas on there if you want to get a really good experience. The Avatar comes with antennas, but I gather they're not the best, so you probably still want to spend another $100. So you're looking at probably near enough to $700 for the goggles, which is quite expensive for what you get. The Fatshark version of the goggles, although they look identical to the Avatar ones, apparently the Fatsharks only do with 2S to 5S power in, whereas the Avatars do 2S to 6S. Now, I find that kind of strange, and it's a bit disappointing if you're a Fatshark enthusiast, because many people who fly freestyle have 6S batteries these days. That's your flight pack. 4S is a bit old-fashioned. Most people fly 6S because of the benefits you get from it, and it's so nice to be able to just grab a flight pack, plug it into your goggles and go fly. If you can only use up to 5S, you're going to have separate batteries for your goggles, which most people will have some, but it's just a little annoyance thing. And so why didn't they make it 6S? I mean, like the Avatar ones are. We don't know. And there's a few teardowns popping up on YouTube. There should be teardowns comparing the goggles soon. See, because Fatshark say they designed the goggles, they're all Fatshark, but Avatar ones look very, very similar. Same specs, same everything else, except the battery voltage. So I'm going to be very interested to see a side-by-side between the Avatar goggles and the Fatshark goggles. Are they just the same with a different sticker, or is there actually completely different electronics? We don't know. We'll find out. And speaking of teardowns, I'll link in some teardown videos on here. There are some interesting teardown videos already, and there's a lot that can be learned from those. So far it's looking pretty good. The quality of the hardware looks pretty damn good. Now the Fatshark WalkSnail system has a 1080p mode. Now DJI doesn't have a 1080p mode. Do you need a 1080p mode? Well, my eyes are only 720p, so for me, not such a big deal. And when you go to 1080p, you're going to have a boost in latency. But if you're someone that likes cruising around admiring the scenery, 1080p may be really, really useful to you. Other thing to remember is that the camera will be 1080p. So when you record with the onboard DVR, which has 8 gigabytes of built-in memory, you will get a 1080p image, not a 720p image like you get with the DJI Air unit. I think that's only 720p. So there's a few little benefits there. The Air unit also is kind of a halfway between a Vista and a DJI Air unit. It's quite small, it's reasonably light, has antenna diversity, all the good things that we love. So yeah, there's nothing to really criticize there. What else did I have here? I had, one thing. I know a lot of people are going to be asking, if you've got yourself a nice set of goggles, you might have bought some Fatshark HDO2s or some SkyZone 04Xs. Can you get a video receiver for the system? Why can't you get a WalkSnail video receiver like with the HD0, plonk it on the front of your goggles and enjoy the best of all worlds? Well, I don't know. Maybe they'll do that, or maybe they want to make money out of goggles and not just sell video receivers. It'll be interesting to find out. This will be something, if you're thinking of buying now, you're sitting on the fence going, should I buy? Remember, they may come out with a video receiver, in which case it would be a lot cheaper than a full set of goggles. And if you've got a set of SkyZone 04Xs or HD02s, why would you want to buy a whole new set of goggles when all you need is a receiver to get all the benefits of the system? And you'll still have analog in as well to fly your old stuff. Worth thinking about. So there you go. I've sort of tried to cover as many bases as I can without having a system in hand. If you want to send me a system, Fatshark, go for it. I'd be more than happy to look further into it. So I've just looked at what other people have put up and tried to join some dots, hopefully to give you a little bit more information from someone who has a bit of technical knowledge. The thing you're going to be asking though is, should I rush out and buy this thing? Should I be investing my hard-earned money in this new system? Well, the highway the FPV highway is littered with a few corpses in terms of digital FPV systems in the past. There was the Connex system, which started out with Hiss and Aurora, and I think Rotor Riot even promoted it and had a video about it, and then just sort of died because it didn't deliver everything we wanted. There's been a few others that have popped up from time to time and looked great and then just sort of faded away into the background obscurity. There's no guarantees that this system will survive. It's a small market. The FPV market, you know, we're a small group of people. I wouldn't expect them to sell more than a few thousand units in the first 5 or 6 months, and that's given that, you know, that's globally. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe they'll sell a heap, but the market's already pretty well serviced. A lot of people who wanted digital have gone DJI, a lot of people who wanted digital have gone HD0. Those people are probably not going to sell all their existing gear to buy into a system that's going to cost them the best part of $1,000 to get started and get going. So yeah, it's a big ask. And I think, let's say, if I was a DJI user, I think Tommy, oh my God, he put it quite well. He said he's got so much tied up in DJI, he's not going to shift platforms. It would cost him a fortune to re-equip all his models with the Fatshark system. It's not economically viable. And I think most people who fly DJI are in the same boat. They've got quite a few Vistas and Air units, and they've got their goggles, and it all still works. It all works. This new product isn't going to stop anything else from working. So they'll probably stick with the DJI, at least for the foreseeable future. If you're using HD0, it's probably going to be a harder choice for you guys because you probably don't have as much invested. I mean, the HD0 video receiver, it wasn't that expensive, and the transmitters are not that expensive. So you may be more inclined to go, I really wanted the DJI system, but I hate DJI, so I can buy this because it's not DJI. They may get some defections from the HD0 camp. Carl's going to have to work very, very hard over there to keep people online. He's talked about open sourcing, but I've seen, apart from a design for goggles, the case for the goggles, I've seen none of the software, none of the firmware released into open source. I think he should do that right now to get a sense of community ownership of the HD0 system that will encourage loyalty and people to stick with that, because there's a huge amount of support for open source stuff. Now, the Fatshark system is not open source. DJI is not open source. HD0 has the potential to be the only open source option in the digital arena. And we've seen how open source has worked for flight controllers, for transmitter software. It really does do a good job of promoting sales of hardware. So I think Carl that should be his #1 priority right now, getting the open source, get a GitHub repository set up and get the community involved in improving that system. Although it is limited by the hardware. The hardware is nowhere near as sophisticated as the other digital systems on the market, even from an RF perspective or from a video perspective. It's just not as sophisticated. So it's a bit of an uphill row for Carl. But if you're an HD0 user, you're probably still going to sit on the fence for a while. You're probably not going to rush out and buy this because we still need to see just how much of an effect these firmware updates, this tuning has on the performance of the system. And if you're an analog user, well, now you're spoilt for choice, aren't you? You've got 3 digital systems you can choose from, and any of them will be better than the analog you're using. Now, having said that, I have HD0, I have DJI, don't have the Fatshark system yet, and I have analog. I spend most of my time flying analog. It's a different experience. It's a kind of a visceral experience. There are some benefits to analog, apart from price, which transcend picture quality. And I might do a video on that. If you're interested, I'll do a video explaining why I am so in love with analog. But if you're flying analog, you can still afford to sit on the fence for a while. If the WalkSnail Fatshark system is good, it's not going away. If you wait until the next flying season, wait to fly the rest of the summer in the Northern Hemisphere with what you've got, and then watch over winter and decide to make your purchase in the spring of next year, that's probably about the best time, because this will have had a chance to really mature, really bed in, and it will, if it goes to plan, it'll probably outperform the DJI system. And in that case, by then. There may be a reduction in the chip shortage. Things may even be cheaper then. So I would say that is your best option. But if you want to jump now, just on what I've seen with the reviews and what I know of how these systems work and what I've seen of the hardware, well, I don't think you'll go too far wrong. If you really want to get into digital, this is now, I think, a viable option. I can't confirm that because I don't have a system to look in deeply, but from what I have seen, let me put that caveat on there. From what I have seen, I think the system is already pretty good, and it could be a hell of a lot better once they've got the tuning done, once they've done that. So it's happy days for FPVers. You can't go wrong. Doesn't matter what you fly, it's all good. So there you go. Now, if you've got questions or comments, I may do should I do a live stream on this so I can do an interactive discussion of points, because I'm sure a lot of you have questions already over what I've said. And if you want to go down to the commenting bit and tell me, yes, do a live stream, Bruce, and I'll do the first ever live stream on RC Model Reviews, or maybe I'll do it on NextJet, I don't know. And we'll discuss those issues, and if you've got particular questions, I'll try and answer them. In the meantime, yeah, that's all I have to say about this. And WalkSnail, if you want to send me a system, Fatshark, if you want to send me a system, I'm up for it. And I will do my usual critical analysis and tell you what I think. So yeah, I will be out there flying FPV no matter what, because it's one of the best parts of the hobby there is. There you go, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my Patreon supporters. Without you, I couldn't even dream of doing all this stuff. And hopefully the information I've presented is of value to you. Bye for now.